Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Teacher Talk. My name is Christopher Hansen. I have the distinct privilege of serving my community as the Director of Music Education and Orchestral Activities at Seattle Pacific University. Go Falcons. And I am honored to have one of my dear friends and colleagues here with us today, Dr. Jennifer Voigt. It is so amazing to be connecting with her in this time of social distancing, which I hope everyone is observing and staying safe as we physically distance ourselves. It does not mean that we have to stay distanced spiritually and intellectually and emotionally. And I am so grateful that technology has allowed us to still reach out to our friends and our peers and our family and our colleagues in particular, as educators all over the world are trying to navigate this new landscape that we're in. What is life during this pandemic? What does it mean to teach and engage others in the arts while you're socially distancing? And it's these extraordinary questions we've had to ask ourselves, and the even more extraordinary solutions that people have come up with. I have been in conversation with so many of my students over the past month or so as they're trying to navigate the professional landscape. As so many people know, jobs are being furloughed or districts are cutting back on the arts, particularly in the public school realm. But even in private schools, there's a weird schism that I have seen in the Pacific Northwest of private schools not having to. I always want to breach this conversation carefully, but they have more autonomy is the very PC way of me putting it, because they don't rely on tax dollars. And so when governor creates mandates or things are happening, we do see a lot of Christian academies or private schools in general, whether or not they have a religious affiliation, going into hybrid instruction or doing the face-to-face instruction and preparing appropriately. Most of the schools that I know that have started that have done a really good job of creating safeguards, because they usually have small student populations that are contained in really specific geographic areas. And so, and I'm still praying for both peace and guidance for the administrators that are sort of dealing with all of that. But it creates this differentiation that we have to struggle with, that, well, why are the private school kids already in face-to-face instruction? And why can't my kids do that? I'm in a public school, and so why don't I have it? So we're trying to navigate this idea of equity and inclusion in the midst of the pandemic as well. And as I'm talking to my students and trying to offer some guidance and really just have conversations about what does the future look like and what possibilities do we have in this new world we're living in, one of the things that comes up is the idea of calling and trying to stay true to what your passions are and where you believe your talents are. Whatever your faith background, wherever you are in life, I don't think that I am stretching very far to say that everyone usually feels that purpose in their life, that they feel that they're being pulled in a certain direction, or that they've been really blessed or given certain talents or certain opportunities to sort of push them in a certain direction in terms of their career path and sometimes even their personal decisions. Now is the time for me to have a family. Now is the time for me to get married. Now is the time for me to move. We're getting all of this stimulus, from friends, from faith institutions, from universities, from mentors that tell us, hey, this is the best path forward. How do we navigate all that? Who do we listen to when we feel called to do something? So as I was talking to my students, and I can openly admit, talking to myself, I never imagined when I transitioned to higher ed that I'd be teaching during a global pandemic. Was not in my 5-year plan. And so, like, I'm teaching things online and in hybrid, and I don't see my students the way I usually do. I don't conduct my orchestra the way I usually do. So, like, what does that mean, and how do I navigate that? So this is my long-winded preface. I've got all these things going in my mind, and immediately one of my dear friends, Jennifer, popped into my head. And I have been so humbled and amazed at her journey that she's taken with her partner and with her family, and the things that she's done in terms of her career, the success that she's had, the struggles that she's had, and how she's navigated them, the way she stayed connected to her faith through her profession. It's genuinely humbling and so impressive. And I reached out to her and said, hey, I would love to be able to engage you in one of our teacher talks and just learn more about your journey and where you are and what you're doing and how you advise your students that are interested in performance or interested in working with the church or interested in working in higher ed. And I'm so grateful that she agreed. For those of you that might be new to Teacher Talks, so this is a platform that's designed for me to be able to speak with colleagues and friends. It's sponsored by Seattle Pacific University and specifically student organization that we have on campus called the Falcon Feathers. It stands for Future Educators in the Arts, Transforming Human Experience and Realities. And so this is art educators that are majoring in art education, whether it's music or theater or dance or visual arts that are at SPU. Originally, it was just going to be a way for me to connect with my students while we were in online learning, and it's really blossomed into this really great weekly episode where I can talk to friends and colleagues all over the world about art and education and its transformative power. So this week, we're talking to Dr. Jennifer Voigt and going to hear a little bit from her about where she's been and where she's going. As we are talking, please feel free to join the conversation. So we're streaming on YouTube and on Facebook, and I encourage you to just post questions or comments that you have, and we'll bring those into the conversation as we can. And I'm just so grateful for you sharing some of this time with us. I hope that the words that Jennifer and I share can inspire you and help guide you to continue to use your gifts and your talents. And so I think we're good. We've got a number of viewers that I can see in my stream, and I always like to give a little buffer at the beginning so people have time to join us. So Jennifer, I want to turn it over to you. Thank you again so much for joining me. It's been crazy this past semester and life is happening, but I'm grateful for your time. And tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're coming from and where you are right now.
Absolutely. So, as he said, my name is Jennifer Voigt, and I am currently teaching as an adjunct voice professor and voice and oral theory at Southeastern University in Lakeland, Florida. And I'm also worship leader at a church plant in Lakeland called City Place Church, as well as teaching online diction for my previous position in Odessa College. And a whole other bunch of hats, like having 2 kids 2 and under. So there's a lot going on in my life. And we recently, as a family, made a big switch. Let me tell you a little bit about my background. My undergraduate degree is from Baylor University, as is my husband Tyson's, and we're both in music education. I was in choral track, he's in instrumental track as a percussionist. I went on to get my master's in voice performance because I just wasn't done learning about my instrument. I was falling in love and I wanted to know more about it, and I'm glad I did. I got my master's in performance, which is where I met Chris's wife in my master's, and I love her dearly. And got that at Texas State, and then got married. And my husband and I, yes, my husband
Go
and
Bobcats.
I love Chris there too. I'm sorry, but I love Erin so much. It's just hard, she's the first one that comes to mind. You can understand that. You're married to her.
Absolutely.
But also met Chris there as well. And then we moved to Miami, University of Miami, to get our doctorates at the same time. We were blessed to both be accepted with scholarships at the same time, which is amazing. And so we did really a big deal. And so we both did our DMAs there in performance and pedagogy, and moved to New York for a year. And then I got a job as a full-time voice faculty at a college in Odessa, Texas, Odessa College. And so I taught there for 3 years. And we have recently, so that's all the background, we have recently made a big switch. So I had a baby there, and then I got pregnant again, and COVID happened. And then all of a sudden there was a whirlwind for a couple months. My husband got offered a job here in Lakeland, and within a couple months we had sold our house. We weren't able to say goodbye to any of our friends and family. We were doing church remotely. We were worship leaders at our church in Odessa as well. I had the baby. 2 weeks later, we moved across country, still during the pandemic, to Lakeland with a newborn and a 2-year-old. And I was leaving full-time work for 3 years so that my husband now can pursue a full-time position, because he was adjunct where we were. And I knew that was on his heart for a long time, that he wanted that position of being full-time and to have influence within the faculty and to build a program. And so I was he dropped everything for me when we went to Odessa. I was more than happy to give him that time as well. So this is our new life. So I am adjunct, which actually fits my personality pretty well, because I like to have variety in my schedule. Adjunct, and then also worship leading. And that's kind of where we are with our babies, hanging out in Lakeland.
And it's interesting. I remember having to have this conversation with my mom, and to use the Texas phrase, bless her heart. It was a big shock, I think, for my family. I'm a first generation college student, and even for me, getting into to college was a big deal. And I remember being bit by the bug early on and just falling in love with learning and college and the whole atmosphere. But
Yeah.
I definitely had this call to serve in public schools, and I taught in public schools for 8 years, and then felt I think it's time for me to transition. I want to teach teachers. I want to go into higher ed, and it this I hope this doesn't sound arrogant, because people that know me, I think, can appreciate this statement. Like, I was shocked at how much I didn't know coming into higher ed, because I am someone that is very studious. I ask tons of questions. I'm a very curious person, and I had been in grad school for years, as my wife is very eager to tell people that I spent a long time in grad school because I was just obsessed with learning and like getting degrees and wanting to study. And so here I had been immersed in college. I don't know if I've never done the math. It had at least been 7 years. And then I had started a PhD program. So I have been in colleges or universities as a student for over a decade,
Wow.
broken up a little bit, but, for more than 10 years. And so then transitioning into higher ed, I was so oblivious to, and none of this is meant to sound like nefarious or bad, but just the political structures, the hiring structures, and what that looks like. And I bring that up because you mentioned being a professor, being an adjunct. And I brought my mom up because I remember telling her, hey, I got offered a job and I'm coming in as an assistant professor. And she was like, oh, that's so great. So you're a professor now. And I was like, no, I'm not a professor yet. Like, people can call me professor, but I'm not a full professor yet. I'm coming in as an assistant. So
Right.
that's really great. She was like, I don't understand. And I was like, well, there are adjuncts and there are instructors, and then there are assistant professors and associate professors and full professors, but I'm also in a tenure track, which is really great because I could have just been assistant professor without tenure. She's like, what are you talking about? You're a professor. I was like, no, 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 it's not that simple. And I really didn't like I was conscious that faculty that I worked with had these different titles, but it didn't really mean anything to me. So for people that are watching, I always try to help my students, and I actually have a freshman music ed major right now that feels this real passion. She goes, I really want to teach at the collegiate level. I'm really interested in that. I was like, okay, I want to do my due diligence to say, let me explain the structures to you, because you can work at a university and not necessarily be a full-time professor. So I wanted to offer that clarification that, and
Yeah.
it changes a little bit based on the institution. West Coast versus East Coast titles can mix up a little bit, but
Yeah.
there is a hierarchy.
It-
And being tenured, the elusive tenure that everybody hears about, this was, I think, the biggest shock for me. I don't think the vast majority of the populace realizes that professors are basically itinerant workers. I mean, we work on a contract
mhm.
that's good for a year.
Yes.
And at any point, theoretically, in loose quotes, your contract doesn't have to be renewed.
Right.
Now, the process of getting hired at a university or a college is pretty strenuous, no matter where you are. There's multiple rounds. There's usually a national search. So it's in the university's best interest, because they have to usually spend money
Right.
to vet that process and fly people in, and it usually costs money to do a hire. So when you get hired, if you're hired into a tenure track position, it means that you have the opportunity for tenure. It's usually 3 to 5 years is the tenure process. So that university in general is making a commitment with you that we're going to bring you in on a tenure track position, give you 3 to 5 years to see if this works. And then we're going to review your submission and your files and decide whether or not we want to keep you permanently. So the tenure means you have an indefinite contract, that you work at that university full time forever and ever. Amen. Which is why professors are hungry to get that, because before that, you're on a year to year contract, and your program that you're working with and the school you're working with, they have to renew that. So I had to sort of explain that to my mother, because we were moving from Central Texas to the Pacific Northwest for a year-long contract. And that's a very scary leap of faith when you make that jump. And it was the same when I was teaching public school. Texas did not have a tenure system. Some states do for public school teachers. Every year my contract had to be renewed. It had to be signed off by the school board. And I think that's a big misconception that people have, that when you're university faculty that we're all the same. And we're not. There's lots of different levels, and you could be. I have good mentors that have been working at universities for decades. One in particular, who I think needs to remain nameless because too many people would know who I'm talking about. But I was shocked to find out they weren't tenured. Been at the university for 30 years, have developed an incredible program. And when I got offered the job, I went to them as a mentor and I asked for some advice. And they were like, "Oh yeah, I would definitely go for it. You know, I'm still struggling because I'm not tenured." And I thought, how's you've been there for 30 years, you have this amazing reputation, but you still wait every year to get your contract. Like it blew my mind. So I don't know if, as comfortable as you are, if you want to share any of that, of navigating that, of, as you mentioned, you had a position at a college and so then your partner is adjuncting and now vice versa, and what that means to sort of navigate that space.
Yeah, I don't have as much experience with that because there wasn't a tenure system at the school I was at in Texas. It wasn't put in place. So I've always been year to year. I think there are pros and cons. I mean, I think it's nice to have when you've earned that stability to have a document that protects your employment. But I also think that there are professors that have been tenured and maybe shouldn't have been, and it
Yes.
becomes an issue of them not being able to, to change that situation if it needs to change. So I think there are pros and cons. It's not something that has really affected my family, though, I would say.
Mm.
I know
And-
Tyson is not on a tenure track right now.
oh, did he? But he came in. Is he serving as an assistant professor?
Yes.
Nice.
Yeah.
You know, and the thing that bothers me, just in terms of like the practicality of it, is none of these positions are really attainable without a terminal degree.
Right.
And I think that's the scary thing is, when people talk about being a professor and assuming that you sort of made it, quote unquote, in your discipline, it's really the beginning of a journey. I mean, because it can be years that you're with an institution and then you can leave, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. You could spend 3 or 5 years at a place and then it's not a good fit, and then you go find another university.
Right. Well, and my definition of success and what that terminal goal is has changed
Hmm.
over time, because there was a professor once, or a mentor of some sort, that said, you're not trying to attain recognition, or even, in my mind, a certain profession as far as the title is concerned. If you are passionate about the work you do, then that will take you in those directions.
Hmm.
But if your focus is to have a certain title or to have a certain recognition, you're always going to fall a little short of that. And
Wow.
I would say that is absolutely accurate. I think if you're passionate about what you do, and this is what I tell my students, if you want to major in music, awesome. Major in music. You can't imagine doing anything else with your time. Now, make music by all means, no matter what you study and what you do as a career. Make music. Everybody should be making music.
Amen.
Do not major in it. Do not make it your career unless it's the only thing that you can imagine being happy doing, because it's hard. It's
Yeah.
hard. And it's very true. No one is going to come and knock on your door and ask you to sing. No one's going to come and knock on your door and ask you to play. No one's going to come knock on your door and ask you to teach, even. Okay. I mean, as you get a reputation and you make connections, they may ask you to come and do a master class,
Yeah.
but it's not, you have to seek out opportunities. And you have to love what you do so much that you're willing to put that time in and that work in, and not just assume that because you have a talent or a little bit of background in it, that's going to carry you through. And I think that if those students come in with that mindset, they're a lot more successful and they tend to focus a lot more in their studies.
Man, that is sage advice, and it's so true. It's interesting. I feel like I have learned, being, because I'm in my second year now at SPU, and it has been a huge shift, a huge adjustment, where a lot of what I assumed I would be doing was what I did in high school. Working with young musicians, teaching them about the craft, and just maybe doing it with a greater sense of sort of rigor and depth. Um, and I have found that it's kind of the opposite, that a lot of the students that are coming to study have this incredible musical talent, incredible musical knowledge. So much of what I find myself doing is teaching systems. And to your point, teaching them what it means to have a career in music, that it is not just making music all the time.
Right.
I wish it were that simple. It is learning these systems. I want to be a music educator. Well, where? Do you want to do it in a community music program? Are you thinking about adjuncting? Are you thinking about teaching in higher ed or K through 12? Are you interested in early childhood? Because each one of these opportunities has a very radically different career path of how you prepare yourself and what opportunities you seek getting into that field. And it was such a shock, I think, to everyone's system when the pandemic hit, because and I remember, and I try to humble myself like this regularly because it is the truth. There's so much that we don't know. And when the pandemic hit, I had very much this like existential crisis. I was talking to one of my colleagues and I said, "What am I supposed to teach students right now? There are no books on teaching in a pandemic. Like there's no one is prepared for this." And
No.
like I am teaching them about pedagogy, I'm teaching them how to teach, but I'm teaching them how to teach in literally a world that is gone. Like the world that I learned how to teach, that I taught in, doesn't exist anymore, and we're in this new space. And so I remember distinctly walking into one of my classes and telling them we had a chapter we were going to read, and it was all about building after school music programs and how to explore alternative styles. And I was like, I want you to have this information, I want you to know this, but I want you to understand that we are now studying history. We are no longer studying this roadmap of what it's going to look like. And I can't tell you what it's going to look like
Right.
because the world has been altered by this experience. And this is a good dovetail. A good friend of mine, Dr. Brandon Beck, extraordinary scholar, human being, educator, musician, who I met in Central Texas. He had asked a little bit about what it's like leading worship with online church and being in COVID. And I think this might be an excellent segue to talk about how have you how have you approached this new world we're living in, where there's so many different directions to go, because for singers, doing auditions, the all the summer festivals and the things that they would usually do, so much has been canceled. So
Right.
career trajectories are radically different on what that looks like. Every state is dealing with it differently. So I know Nats has been kind of in an uproar because some people are still holding those, and there are these great networking and career opportunities. Other states have canceled Nats.
Right.
So
Or
that
virtual or yeah.
yeah. So
Mhm.
that's changing. What's happening for those that are interested in the worshipful arts, that are interested in doing music to enter into the church or doing that kind of I mean, that has all been changed. I'm so fascinated. I didn't realize that you were still working with Odessa College and doing some online courses. So the
Correct.
fact that you can be living in Florida, but that you can keep that connection in Texas and be teaching. I mean, so and I know that's like a million different questions. Please feel free to choose any of them or all of them. But I appreciate Brandon bringing that up. So, what has it been like for you personally going into this world as a musician and an educator and a worship leader with this online platform, with the pandemic in general?
Right. Well, I'll hit from three different angles there. First of all, I just had a baby in June. I've only done one concert since then because there are no gigs right now.
Right.
There are no gigs. And I don't have extra time to edit footage and to stream because he's still not sleeping through the night. But when I did sing on that concert, which is our faculty recital for SEU last month, it was so freeing to be able to make music and share. I'm sorry, you can probably hear the loud sports car going down my street. Anyway, to be able to share that again, I mean, it was just like a breath of fresh air. That's the thing, though. If you're passionate about what you do, you're gonna find a way to do it. I had a
Yeah.
family member say that, well, you're not going to be doing concerts anymore. There's not going to be opera anymore. That's BS. I mean, if we're talking, we've had pandemics in the past. The arts have survived every pandemic. We're going to be fine.
Yeah.
We do need to adjust, which we are. It's making those people who are super passionate and have the time. Thank God somebody does, because I will soon and I'm going to be back in there. But the people that have that passion and the time are getting honed in on those skills we didn't have before. We were not pushed into technological skills before. We were not
Yeah.
encouraged to grow in that way. And we should have been. And now we are struggling with that, but we are growing and we are evolving and we are creating new spaces to make art, right? And so that's amazing. And we're going to continue to do that. No, we're not going to die. That's silly. Yeah, we're going to survive this. It's going to look different. We will have traditional things eventually as well, when we can open back up and do things in our acoustic spaces and things like that. Yeah. But we also have this amazing new branch of people who are more equipped to be dealing with technological performances and streaming and things like that, which is excellent too. Kind of like when we first had recording come on the scene, right? Then we're not all separated overseas in different countries anymore, and we get to hear music from different cultures, and it's gonna build on that. As far as teaching in academia goes remotely, it's a struggle. Yes, I mean, I will do it. I will do it because I love what I do, and I love my voice kids so much, but it's hard. It's really difficult to teach something as hands-on as voice over Zoom. I'm with permission, of course, I have to check breathing. I have to see them, sometimes the lighting's bad. I can't get a kid to buy an Ethernet cable so that they're not freezing and or the connector that they need now, which don't even get me started on the Macs and not being able to hook up all the wires that need to be hooked up. We've got these beautiful mics that we bought for all the practice rooms on campus, but the kids can't plug in because they don't have the connector for anyway, we got through it. We came out the other end stronger, but it's hard. And I know they're frustrated, and I know I'm frustrated. And I'm not going to lie. Did I put a mask on and stand outside and push on a couple kids this semester for 5 minutes? Yes, because they were not getting the breathing. And I just turned to the side and punched them in the gut while they sang and said, "You feel that? Okay, good. Let's go back to our rooms now and sanitize." Because it's hard. It's hard to hear overtones. It's hard to hear resonance sometimes, depending on the sound quality, and if I'm being honest, we are probably some of the more safe, I would say, as far as concerned with safety, as far as that goes, the people in our area, we are more, what is a good way to say this? We are distancing, I think, a little more often than some other people in our area are. We feel less comfortable with not distancing. And so I've been very careful to make sure, because I do have students that have gotten the virus, and I'm glad I wasn't in a room with them, and I want them to get better, and they are, and, we're moving forward. But, with a baby at home, I'm not willing to take that risk. And with elderly grandparents 2 hours away, I'm not willing to take that risk. But I do want to give them a good education, and I know how hard it is. So that's been a struggle. We have actually had hybrid. So our voice lessons were all over Zoom, but we have had a hybrid oral theory class. Now, there were 10 people in my section, and we had a very large room, and everyone was masked, and I only let them come 5 people at a time. So on Tuesdays, 5 people would come spread out. On Thursdays, the other 5 people would come spread out. And we were over 6 feet apart. It was very spacious in that room. And we did oral theory that way. And then when they weren't in the classroom, they were on Zoom. Now, let me tell you, if you are a student watching, please show some grace to your professors, because we're just as frustrated as you are. It is so hard to look at, you're used to this traditional classroom, engaging with the people in front of you. Oh, wait, I need to make sure I'm also engaging with these people that are on Zoom and making sure that they have their cameras on and they're not glazed over or doing something else, or they're not chatting, writing in the chat. And I totally miss that sometimes, because I can't answer questions here, look on there, and then remember to check the chat window. It's crazy. It's a whole other skill. It's kind of like early on in music ed, when I learned how to play with one hand and sign a different part in the other hand. Yep. You have to develop it. So that's been a struggle. And I think people are just having to adjust. It's really frustrating. And I mean, bless their hearts. I really feel for these kids, because yes, It is very difficult. Every generation that goes through school has stuff that's difficult. You're not the only ones that have stuff that's difficult. But yeah, you've got a lot that you're having to deal with. And as much as we can, we're trying to help you navigate through it while we're trying to navigate through it and help you evolve to become the educators that this current situation needs and the performance that this current situation needs. And I think one thing that we need our students to know is now more than ever, families and friends have a hard time supporting you pursuing a degree in music. I've had this conversation with my students. They're worried there aren't going to be any jobs. They're worried that you're wasting your time, you're wasting your money. But honestly, it's like I said before, if you're passionate about it, if this is what you imagine yourself doing, period, then do it, because you'll find a way. If you're that passionate, you're going to find a way, and you might lead the way for other people to do it.
Absolutely.
So you may be a key person in making that change that opens the door for other people that wouldn't otherwise be able to. So absolutely pursue it. That would be academia. If we're talking about worship, there's something really beautiful. Well, first of all, something really frustrating. On Facebook, this has been frustrating me. I've been seeing a lot of posts, I'm sure with all good intentions behind it, trying to be respectful and really appreciative to our first responders and our healthcare workers. Absolutely. Of course, we appreciate them. They are integral and we absolutely need them, right? But I think it's unfair to call the arts non-essential. And I've been seeing that a lot. If you want to imagine a life where you go to church and there's no music, there are no psalms, by the way. It changes the Bible because the psalms are songs.
Ooh, talk about it.
No literature. There are no movies. There are no TV shows. So when you are stuck at home during the pandemic, you have nothing to escape with from your daily stresses. There's no art. Everything is plain. If you think about every tiny little piece of your life that is influenced by some sort of art, it is absolutely not non-essential. It is our very humanity that exists within that. Okay, it is the feelings, it is what we've gone through, it's our history, it's how we're processing, it's how we're expressing. And if we don't do that stuff and we keep all that stuff bottled up and we don't show future generations what we have been through with our art, then we're going to regret that very much when we get down the road.
Amen.
Now, I will say, when my husband and I were in Germany visiting family, I saw something there that I have not noticed. And it's not that this isn't true elsewhere, but I had not noticed before where we're from. There was an incredibly healthy love for the arts as amateur music makers in the community. I was completely caught off guard by that, and I thought it was amazing. I mean, you would get in the car and hear all styles in a taxi of music playing, opera, classical music, pop, everything. And they really loved Broadway, American Broadway there. And you could go out into any square or any public space, and there was some sort of music going on. And most of them were not professional trying to make a living off of it. It was amateur ensembles, but they were loving every minute of it. And the community came and supported them and wanted them. I think we need to be encouraging that more in our community. I think this idea that you have to be super talented and perfect at it and professional at it to make art is part of the reason that maybe our society feels that way.
Yes.
And so the reason I bring that up is because when I've worked in worship, I've realized how important that amateur music making is as a worship leader, right? Because if you come into rehearsal and there's no one that has invested in bettering themselves through lessons on their instrument, learning how to read, even if it's by ear, being able to play, if no one has taken that time, you're by yourself up there doing all these songs, right? But it's such a breath of fresh air. And this will be a shout out to my worship team. If anybody there has been scrolling through Facebook and is watching, it's so refreshing to be able to go on Wednesday and say, hey, can we make this change, this change, this change? Can you go home and play through this and maybe try it this way or voice it this way, voice those chords this way? And to know that like they're going to go home and do that and be a better musician next time I see them, because they wanted to take the time to make that music excellent, not as a professional musician, but
Yeah.
just because of their love for the Lord and wanting to contribute to worship. And that is incredible and awesome. And I'm so appreciative for that. And I think that needs to be a more prevalent part of our culture.
I'm so glad you bring that up because I had the incredible privilege of serving as a contemporary worship leader at the First Presbyterian Church in San Marcos, Texas, when I was in grad school, and it was a godsend. It was not something I had sought out. It was an opportunity that came up and literally helped me survive, like paid my rent, and it was a job that I was not seeking. I had been playing my violin in the worship band and just sort of supporting the worship band as a musician. And I honestly don't even remember. I might have been getting paid or something as like a scholarship because they knew I was a college student, but I
Right.
was coming just in worship. And then the worship leader ended up leaving and took a full-time job with another church. And it suggested like, hey, do you mind taking over? Would you be interested in taking over? And I'm thinking like, what? Like I've never really done something like this. And I guess, and I had played in worship bands forever. I mean,
Right.
since I can remember, I'd played my violin or done something and just kind of grown up with it. And it's interesting what you mentioned. Now, realize I'm coming from it as a violinist who had been an orchestra conductor. And so for me, it was very much an ensemble. And I was like, okay, I need to bring people into the ensemble. So I reached out to my friends, and we had on drums, on guitar, and on keys. And then we had a keyboard player that was a volunteer, two keyboard players that were volunteer that also did backup vocals, and a bass player that was a volunteer. Um, and then we'd have a few other people that would come and do vocals every now and then someone that volunteered to do guitar every now and then. But that core group, I was like, I only want music majors. I want professional musicians. And the first few months of our rehearsals, I realized that I was completely leaving out the church members that wanted to be involved in worship because we're calling chord changes and talking whether or not we should do inversions and the voicings and an orchestration of it. And I'm like, just wait 4 bars, then come in here, and then I want a drum fill here. And I'm using all this technical jargon, and the volunteers for the band were just completely lost. And
Right.
it was this like really difficult conversation of like, Chris, I really want to praise God with the band, and like I don't feel like I can do that anymore. And I'm studying on my, and I was completely unaware. They're like, I'm studying to just keep up with the conversations you're having, and what I'm doing isn't enough. And I'm like, I don't want that to happen. I don't want
Right.
you to be excluded from this. And it was this real, I'm curious if you had this experience. It was such a double-edged sword because I took over and I brought in some friends. And I should clarify that like none of this was like strategic on my part. It was literally just like, oh, you want me to lead the band? Well, like then I'm gonna bring people that I know to like work with the band that are
Well,
free, and like let's
yeah.
do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the church and the congregation loved it because they were literally getting a concert every Sunday. I mean, we were so into it, and we were such music nerds that we wanted to push ourselves musically. So
Right.
we were creating these like elaborate arrangements, and like
Right.
I don't think Chris Tomlin knew his music could sound like that. We had like I was bringing in cello players, and it was just this whole huge awesome experience. But I struggled with the fact, and this was a big turning point for me. I sat down, we had an interim pastor at the time, and I sat down with the pastor and I said, I think I have realized I have now done a lot of work to build this ensemble. And we started like, it started bringing people to the church. It was like a total sister act moment. Like people
Mhm.
were excited about this because we did the service in the afternoon on Sundays, and we
Right.
served lunch too. So that always helped
Oh,
because
yeah.
you offer college kids food, they're going to show up.
Yeah.
So we like started getting this little following, but I started noticing there were, which I should clarify, when we started there wasn't really a culture of applause during worship, and going like 3 months into it people were always applauding when we finished. And I sat down with the pastor and I said, I think I have turned this into a concert, and it's not a worship experience anymore.
Right.
And that really scares me because I am happy that people are enjoying it, but I think what I am conveying, what they're seeing out of me, is me being a conductor and a performer and me leading this group. And like, how do I find that balance? And therein lied, it was about a year of me like trying to meditate and trying to, because I had not been doing I'd never tried something like that before, but trying to read my Bible more before rehearsals and to
Mhm.
have more prayer in our rehearsals and be more discerning about, I'm not going to, like, I started referring to it like I would program the service, which is so ridiculous because you don't, that's not what you're doing. I'm not building a program, right? I'm trying to build a moment of worship. So it was, trial by fire. I mean, like I had to learn by doing,
Yeah.
but it was very difficult because exactly, again, to your point, forgive me for being so long-winded, but I experienced that where I had separated me being a musician and my faith to where like, yeah, I can
Right.
worship, but I have this moment to make music and that should take precedent because I'm a trained musician, and not seeing that you can do both.
Yeah. And it's not easy. I mean, that's not an easy skill to develop when you're for years training to focus on yourself and find excellence in what
Yeah.
you're doing. And then as an educator, train to make sure that your students, your ensemble is excellent. There is a large part of being a worship leader that has nothing to do with what songs you pick on Sunday
Hmm.
morning.
Yeah.
That's the most important part, actually, if you're being honest with yourself. There's a really great book that a dear friend and worship leader of mine, Colin Proft, recommended to me. It's called Worship Matters by Bob Coughlin. I don't know if you've read that one before.
Oh.
It's really great. He goes through. So he's the Sovereign Grace guy, and he goes through step by step kind of the definition of what he's deemed a worship leader is, which is a really nice definition. And he takes you step by step through each like 3-word phrase in that definition of how that plays out in your life as a worship leader and how you're choosing and rehearsing and building the service basically. And it's been awesome. And I've struggled, especially in this transition, because every church is so different and everybody has different expectations, right? And I am very different as a worship leader now than I was when I started in Odessa. And I agree. I want to bring excellence. I'm a musician. I want to bring creativity. I want to enjoy and feel challenged by the things that I'm bringing into service, but not at the expense of the rest of the team or the congregation. And, there is a little bit of a culture here, and I had never heard this. There are actually like worship band competitions in my area.
What?
Yes. So you can imagine that sometimes the focus in this area is drawn away from what we're actually doing on the stage, right?
Wow.
It becomes very concertized. That's something that I really strive to never let happen at our church, because that's what they're going to get almost everywhere else they're going around here. They're going to get, there's a lot of big churches, they're going to get a big band, lots of lights and the whole 9 yards, right? People leading that don't have musical backgrounds, like there's a music director that's kind of like behind the scenes doing everything, but the person who's leading worship is not necessarily like a trained musician at all. And so, so coming into this job, my focus changed from, I know a lot of churches go on and do the top 10. I know that.
Yeah.
And that's fine. That's not me. That's not my style, and I don't think that's necessarily the most effective way to lead worship. There are songs, including hymns, that have incredible teaching in them, are easy to
Yes.
sing, are repetitive, and that have a range that the congregation can attach to. And if you tell me God's not going to work and the Holy Spirit isn't going to show up in that song just because it's not on the top 10, I don't believe you. So we try to pull. I mean, we've done like 10,000 Reasons, which is old, and we've done hymns, and then we do stuff like Promises from Maverick City Music that's new, and so we pick according to the message and the people that are serving and all this stuff. But there's so much to consider, and I do think there's a tendency right now that like, hey, just because you're a worship leader doesn't mean you're trying to make an album. You don't have to sound amazing. You don't have to be perfect every Sunday. Your band doesn't have to be professional. Now, is it okay To pay members of your band, this is another hot topic that you could go
Oh, wow.
another
Yeah.
hour about. I mean, you can. My personal belief. I mean, I was a ringer and a choir for a church in grad school in Miami, and that was a big blessing to me. Although I was also a believer, so I didn't feel as bad about that. There's a difference in opinion of should we do that for college students? People will usually be more okay with, because they know it's like helping fund their education. But then what about what if you have professional musicians that already go to your church and serve every Sunday, but you don't pay them? That's kind of a hard thing to navigate. And then also, what about non-believers? Is it okay to pay a non-believer to come into service to play every Sunday? They're in front of the word, they're listening to the message, but they're not there to worship, and they're being paid. Is that okay? Is that not okay? Are there circumstances where that's okay every now and then? Is it okay every now and then, or is it never okay? So, I mean, that's a whole other conversation. But I've realized how deep and intricate and complex this job can be. And a lot of it has very little to do with the actual music that you pick out for Sunday.
It's so crazy that you mentioned that, because this is something that I have struggled with for years. I was raised Baptist, and in general, particularly in the Southern Baptist Church, you are there to share the talents that God gave you. There ain't no check. There is a very high expectation, and it's unfair for me to paint with such a broad brush, but this comes from years of working with other Baptist musicians that I feel confident saying that Baptist churches do not usually pay their musicians. And I actually was chastised at a church that I worshiped at once, because I was in undergrad and I had made the inquiry because I was getting gigs with other churches. And then I brought it up that I was like, shouldn't I be on like retainer? Like, you are literally using me. You're programming music so that I will play for you. But shouldn't that, well, God blessed you with this gift and you should want to give it back to him. And that's what the pastor said to me. And I was like, oh my gosh. And in the moment, I was convicted. I felt horrible for even suggesting that I ask it. And then the opposite happened. I went to a different church that was non-denominational at the time. And I was talking to the pastor, and the pastor was committed to offering me something. Actually, this was several years later. I was living in Central Texas and had been invited. My roommate was playing keys in the church and then invited me to come to play violin. And I came and sat in a couple times and had never asked for money. And then the pastor like put me on payroll, and it was like $50 a service or something. It wasn't like a salaried position, but they were like, hey, I want to do that. And I was like, well, no, I'm just like, this is my offering. Right. Like, and I fought with the pastor that I was like, I don't want any money for this. And they said, you're a professional musician. You're doing this out of your good grace, but we want to honor the gifts that God has blessed you with.
Right.
For you to know that it has value. And I had never thought of it from that perspective, that I was being chastised to say the gifts that you've been given have to be given freely to God's people. And then here's this pastor saying, no, by us blessing you, we are showing our gratitude that God has given you these gifts and brought you into the church. And I don't know that either was correct. I think that there are arguments that could be made on both sides. But that is something that even when I started working, which was a short stint, I mean, it was only, I think, like 3 years that I ended up serving as a worship leader, having to have that conversation of like a budget for the worship band, and the intern pastor that we had never paid musicians. So I was like, well, no, that's my expectation. And exactly what you said, it was all college students, and that made it, okay.
Yeah.
And it was like, but wait a minute. But then I worked with my partner as a professional singer in Central Texas for a church, and we were salaried. We were staff with the church.
It depends. And honestly, I mean, if we're being honest, it depends a little bit on the pockets too.
Absolutely.
The pockets are in the church. I see you have a comment of someone who said that they became a believer because a music minister invited them to play and worship. That's awesome.
Oh yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, Brandon shared some of his story. I've had him on as a guest. I think it's funny, I mentioned Sister Act earlier. I just rewatched it because pandemic, right? Like you need to, it's a great movie. Both of them. And I remember watching that movie, and as you get, oh my gosh, I'm like, as you get older. I don't know if I have the right to say that, but like as I get older and experience more, I rewatch some movies that I just think like, oh my, how did I like this, and how did I, and I was watching Sister Act, and I thought like, oh, I just love this movie so much. I just love it, so great. Like the whole time I'm getting ready, both Aaron, my partner, and I were like, oh, I can't wait. Like let's turn it, and we're watching it, and then we both got this kind of cringe at one point that we were like, wait a minute, here is this person who in the storyline is arguably not a believer, who is like under witness protection, like they're under false pretenses, is lying about who they are, but has an incredible musical gift, shares that gift with these nuns, but then the archdiocese uses this to bring people into the church, uses the entertainment to draw people. And what drew people in, there's that like epic scene in Sister Act 1 where like the like hardcore 80s fangirls are out on the street. Lord only knows why they're hanging out like at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning on the street. No one ever talks about that plot hole.
No.
But they're like, I hear doo-wop and I want to go into this church. And so like they come in. It's such a magical moment. But like I said, as I get older, I became such a cynic in that moment that I was like, wait a minute. Like they are totally cheapening this experience, and they're using this as a way to like rope people in so that then they can give them the message. But is God not in the performance already? Is God working through the music to bring people in, or is the music bringing people in so that God can work? And like we both laughed at each other because we were like, there's not a right answer.
No.
But my perspectives are so different now that I remember watching it for the first time. It's the same thing with all of the like hopelessly cliche, Mr. Holland's Opus and all these movies that I'll hear non-musicians talk about. They're like the power of music, and I'm like, no. That's not how it actually works. Like that's not really what it is. Have you struggled at all in the cliches of being a worship leader? And I'm curious what your experiences have been with that. Especially, I love where this conversation has gone, having the identity of being a musician and trying to honor that without becoming elitist, without becoming, well, like I can worship God better because I know all my scales. Like I don't think we need to go that far.
No.
But how have you battled some of those cliches that come with being a worship? You only know 3 chords and you only know top 10. Like that's not true.
Right.
Right.
Well, let me first just add on to what we were saying before. I may be misspeaking. So if someone's watching and says this is wrong, please comment and tell us, or if you know. But in scripture, the people who were performing music in worship were Levites, right? So they were technically paid for their work because they were taken care of by the church, by the temple. So if you think about it that way, they ate from the sacrifices. They were given a portion.
Wow.
So if you think about it that way, the musicians have always been compensated and taken care of by the church for their work because they were priests.
That's powerful. I had never thought about that. And I think you're absolutely correct. I was just doing a quick search, and I'm going to throw this into the chat as well. There's a relatively recent post through there's a website called All About Worship. And there's a really great post by someone that's talking about this and referencing both Exodus and Numbers and talking about the Levites being sort of the original worship leaders.
Right.
I'm going to throw this in the chat just so that people can see that. That's really powerful. So, and I'd never thought of that.
I don't think in my opinion, I don't think it's ever been God's intention for us to not be taken care of for whatever we're bringing to the table as far as our offering to the Lord and our contribution to worship. But as far as you were talking about the being a musician and being a worship leader, it has been an interesting transition in the church.
Actually, I want to put this in before we stray away from it, because I think this is really interesting to look at it biblically, because going back to your point about the significance of informal community music making, it's interesting to me, and this is very inspiring. I want to thank you for this because I want to look more into this idea of the Levites being sort of original worship leaders, being paid, or being compensated through the representation of the church, the sacrifice. I think it's interesting that the these different tribes in Israel, they owned that, and it was a part of their existence that they were trained, to do these things and brought up in the ways of being able to uphold worship.
Right.
And I bring that up because it's interesting that there is a dynamic biblically of people that were trained musicians that were compensated. Even King David, as he was working, he was a musician in the court, right? There are people that trained that are compensated, but God calls all of us to make a joyful noise unto the Lord.
Correct.
That
And it's different.
everyone is called to
Right.
make music, to make art. Everyone is called to do that. But there are certain people that are specifically called and trained, and God has notated in the Bible that they are compensated for that work and for those gifts. So it's very, because right, even at the very beginning, you mentioned that just about the journey that musicians have, about the significance of your experiences in Germany, that the community loved music, but there were still professional musicians, and it didn't make the professional musicians more important or less significant. I think that's interesting that biblically there is a precedent for that. That's really powerful. Thank you for that.
Sure, absolutely.
So forgive me, because then you were talking about something else, about being a worship leader. And
Yeah, well, I was going to say at our church in Odessa, the vast majority of our worship band were actually gigging musicians. So they were doing, playing at venues and concerts and gigs and stuff on the weekends anyway. So they could pick stuff up really fast. We could use terminology with them.
Yeah.
And the bands that we are currently leading is more amateur musicians. So they've had some of them have had a little experience in that, but a lot of them have had, lessons a long time ago as children, or they're self-taught. And it's a very different dynamic. And so, like you say, I have to choose my terminology and the way I express things carefully, sometimes to a fault. I think I use weird gibberish words with them sometimes. I'm going to come in with a and I'm like wow, wow over here, but it's a different dynamic. And actually there have been quite a few people in our church that have been wounded by another church. And so I am very, very purposeful in the way that I want to communicate with them, because I never want them to feel that. I never want them to feel not wanted. I never want them to feel unvalued, because that's absolutely not true. And that adds a kind of another layer. Like I talk about, that's one of those important things that has nothing to do with the music. That is a really big part of my job, is making sure that, the way I'm interacting with the band is showing them that they're valued and that we want them there, and able to spiritually feed them as well.
That's huge. So I'm curious, we only have like a minute left, but I have to ask this because I wanted to bring this back around. So I want to find the right way to phrase this, because I know this is such a loaded question. I'm curious, sort of cart and a horse situation. Did you feel that you were called to use your gifts and your talents to study music and become this professional musician, and then opportunities to lead worship arose? Were you already working in worship, and then that was sort of your exposure to music, and that called you to go study music formally? Because in this episode we've been navigating so many of the challenges and the unique circumstances that faith and higher education and professionalism and elitism, like all of these fantastic, I'm so grateful for this conversation. But I want to circle back real quick before we're done today to where we started, about what we're listening to and how we answer our call. Because again, and I don't want to embarrass you, but I think you're such a beautiful example of someone that has stayed true to your passions, and you have allowed your passions to evolve. And I don't even want to say mature, because as long as I have known you, particularly through my spouse, I have always seen you as someone that's very grounded and very mature, and not whimsical in any way, so that we get that cliche.
Whimsical.
You can, but I feel like, especially being in higher ed now, I talk to prospective students, and parents get this idea that their kids are like running away to join the circus when they want to be music majors. Like, you're gonna go off to be a musician, and I'm like, hold on, like it's pretty rigorous, and like you're gonna have a bachelor's degree, and so. And because again, I'm saying all this to compliment you, that I've always seen you as someone that is very pragmatic, and you do things and you do them successfully. And I know from personal experiences with you that a lot of that is rooted in your faith, of you answering God's call and following his direction in your life. So do you have any, and again, I know such a huge question, but do you have any advice or anything that you'd like to say here at the end of what does it mean to listen for a call, wherever that call is coming from? Because I think it's important to recognize that not everybody shares the same faith journey. That's one of the beautiful things about faith. Everybody experiences the world differently. We all have different communion with different people and different things in our lives that brings us closer or further away from what it is that we feel we're supposed to be doing. So knowing all of that, how have you navigated that and brought your musical talents into your faith to be serving you, I dare say, so well, because it seems that you really brought so much into fruition. You are a college professor, you're an educator, you're a performer, you're a worship leader, you're a Christian, you're a mother, you're a spouse, you're a community leader, right? Because in the communities that you serve, you're inspiring people. And again, I'm humbled by that and amazed that you have navigated all of these things so well. What advice or words of wisdom would you offer, particularly young college students that are thinking about this, but just people in general? Brandon has shared some of his story of people that are engaging with music and trying to figure out kind of what it all means in the midst of everything that's going on. I know that's huge, forgive me, but just advice that you have.
Yeah. Well, I'll make it short. You said earlier that the whole trajectory of different paths in our field is kind of put to the side right now. Good. We don't have to have a traditional trajectory for doing music. There are so many ways that we can use music in our professions. There will be ways that you have in your life that you incorporate music that you would have never dreamed up in any classroom in any university. There are ways that you're going to use your degree. You may not even do music ultimately, but there are ways you're going to use your degree that you wouldn't have ever. And I know this is the liberal arts education valuable argument as well. But the truth is that you cannot know what the end result of your life is going to look like. And that's the beautiful thing. There isn't one. You are going to evolve and change. Your definition of success and who you are and the way God's using you is going to be different in every season. So you never want to pursue a degree for, like I said, a certain title. Because, yeah, you may get that. And then you may not have that. And then you may do something else. Or maybe you'll stay in that, but then you'll lose interest and want to do something else later on. That's totally fine. You're not a statue. You're not a machine. You're a person. You're human. Especially in the arts, you're more inclined to run toward what you're passionate about or what is drawing your interest, what's putting you in that flow state than other fields, and that's okay. So there's not just performer, educator, music therapist, worship leader. There can be a hybrid of many things. So do what you feel led to. Go in the direction you feel led to now. But when that starts to shift, do not be afraid of that. Pray about it, press into it, and if doors open, walk through them, because it could be God opening up a new part of your journey that you just couldn't see before.
Man, I love that. That's brilliant. Thank you, Dr. Voigt, so much for your experience and your wisdom and sharing these things with us today. I am so grateful that I was able to connect with you, and I hope that people that were listening were able to not just enjoy this, but hopefully find some of that wisdom and apply it into your own circumstances. I hope more than anything that this is the beginning of conversations for those of you that are listening to this. This will be archived on YouTube. We've got our other teacher talks up there. Please feel free to share the link and share it with others. This is not about finding answers. This is really about asking questions and keeping this conversation, keeping the dialogue going. I'm so grateful that both of us at many times said, I don't know which one is right. And that's the truth. I think that's my students' biggest frustration is that they'll ask me for an answer and I'll go, I don't know. Let's think about it. And then we'll talk for an hour. And they're like, but I still don't have an answer. I was like, I know. Isn't it great? Like, yeah, like it's all about asking these questions. And the questions that we asked today, I think, led to some really rich conversation around what does it mean to follow your passions wherever that is leading you. And your words are so wise and so welcome at the end of this conversation. So thank you again for your time. If you'll stay on, I want to give you a personal goodbye, but for everybody else that's watching, I'm going to log off. Again, this will be archived on YouTube. Feel free to share the link. Thank you to Brandon and others that were commenting during the conversation. I look forward to seeing you all next week for another Teacher Talk.